It's a great pleasure to join all of you here tonight in the House of Labor for this very special event. I want to thank our host, Richard Trumka, and the AFL-CIO for making this splendid space available for us tonight. My name is Joe McCartan. I'm the Executive Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University. I'd especially like to thank a couple of people who helped to put this event together and the logistics of it. Maxine Phillips of Dissent and Charlie Fanning, who's been an intern here and who helped to work on this tonight. Thank you. I'm the Executive Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative, as I said, the Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. The purpose of this initiative is to foster creative and concrete thinking about the problems that afflict workers and the labor movement today in order to help us develop solutions that can foster a more just and equitable society tomorrow. We do this through sponsoring scholarship, conducting research, and convening conversations, especially conversations that bridge the worlds of academia and labor. And it's in that vein that we're honored tonight to join with that vibrant and venerable journal of ideas, Dissent, to mark the launching of this very special issue of that magazine, devoted to workers in the age of austerity. For more than half a century, Dissent has played a unique and important role in this nation's intellectual life. In many ways, it's a journal with long and deep ties to the labor movement and to the issues and ideas that most impact the lives of working people. Its moving force and its founding editor, Irving Howe, was deeply connected to labor, having been an admiring and detailed biographer of Walter Reuther of the auto workers before starting the magazine in 1954. Dissent's concern for American workers and the labor movement persists to this day and is embodied in the commitments of its co-editors, Michael Walzer, and my good friend and colleague and our panelist tonight, Michael Kazin, a man who, like Irving Howe, began his career as an intellectual writing about labor, but who has gone on to become a major authority on so much more, including American politics and the left in general. Never before in recent memory have we needed exactly what Dissent provides more than we need it now. A place to think openly, critically, and creatively about how to revive a politics that takes seriously and prioritizes the needs of working people. We're also delighted to recognize in a special way a good friend to so many in this room, the man who in many ways helped inspire this event, that lion of the local DC bar, Jules Bernstein. It was Jules who inspired Dissent's editors to devote this special issue to workers, and he who helped to put together this esteemed panel tonight that I'm honored to help start off. I serve with Jules on the board of directors of the Interfaith Worker Justice Organization, and we're also pleased tonight that the leader of that group, Kim Bobo, is among us. And I've seen Jules working at IWJ. I've seen him in DC doing all that he does that so many of you know that brings so much good to all that we care about in this city. And I think it's safe to say that Jules is a unique force, and so we thank him for help inspiring this event. It's kind of poetic, I think, that Jules helped to inspire this special issue of Dissent, for it was Dissent's founder, Irving Howe, who in many ways inspired Jules at the very beginning of his career. Howe, as a professor of English and Yiddish literature at Brandeis in the 1950s, met a young Jules Bernstein and helped to influence Jules on the career that he would undertake so well over so many years since, doing so much good. And so it makes a lot of sense, I think, and it's a kind of coming full circle for us to come together around this idea of Jules's and to have this important conversation tonight. Before I turn to the program, first an announcement. As you can see, this event is being filmed. Dissent magazine is filming it for use on their website later so that many others can partake in this discussion who are unable to be with us tonight. The International Association of Machinists is also filming, and Pacifica Radio is recording the event for broadcast there as well. So to get this program started, it's my honor to introduce our first speaker, Kimberly Freeman Brown, Executive Director of American Rights at Work. Kim is a fighter for the interests of workers and the working poor, and under her direction, ARAW has taken leadership in defending workers' rights to organize and leadership in the effort to resist the attacks on collective bargaining that we've seen over the past year and more. Kim has worked her way through the leadership of American Rights at Work over a period of several years. Prior to taking over as executive director in 2009, she served as deputy director for the organization, and before that as its communications director. She has also worked in her past as communications director of the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial. In fact, she's had more than a decade of experience as an organizer and communications strategist in the progressive community. She has one of the clearest voices that are being raised in America today, trying to put front and center the concerns of workers. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce her to you, Kim Freeman Brown. Kim?
Thank you so much, Joe, for that kind introduction. Good evening. It's so good to see all of you and to be in a crowd of like-minded dissenters. I don't often stand in such good company during the course of my day, so it's great to be with you. I'd like to acknowledge the Kalmanowitz Center and Dissent Magazine for hosting this important event. Thank you for what you're doing here with this forum tonight, and to the AFL-CIO for giving this great space, and to all the luminary dissenters in the room. How many of you have actually written for Dissent Magazine? My, yes. So for those of you who have written for the magazine, and for those of us who have expressed their opinions in various other places, often without accolades and always without apology, thank you for what you do. It's an honor to be in your presence tonight. Again, my name is Kim Freeman Brown, and I'm the Executive Director, as Joe mentioned, of American Rights at Work. Chances are you've received emails from me or my communications director, Liz Catania. Don't shoot the messenger, okay? We are an organization that's dedicated to advancing and protecting organizing and bargaining rights, and that's a tall order these days, which is one of the reasons why we're here tonight. So it's great that we have a panel to kind of like talk about these things. Tonight's discussion is titled American Workers in the Age of Austerity, led by our esteemed panelists, Michael Kazin and Harold Meyerson, whom I'll introduce in a moment. It's an important discussion to have in this space, the house that workers built, and in a public sphere. In addition to the pages of Dissent magazine, it's the conversation we're having with the students we teach, with our misguided, conservative-leaning family members over holiday dinners, to one another in safe, progressive spaces. And now we're having it as a part of the very public national dialogue on the economy. Thanks in large part to the soil that was tilled by Dissent magazine and others who, by calling out injustice, have long stoked the embers of dissent that have produced the pushbacks in Wisconsin, in Ohio, and in Indiana, and who planted the seeds that gave birth to the Occupy Wall Street movement. Many of us have been fighting this fight for many decades. I feel that tonight's event is about taking up more space in the public discourse. It's about forcing our opponents to operate within our frame and to defend their defenseless positions in the face of historic income inequality. And there are no two greater opinion leaders to help us take up more space in today's discourse on workers and the current political economy than Michael Kazin and Harold Meyerson. First, we'll hear from Michael, then Harold, and then from all of you. Let me begin the dialogue by introducing Michael. I'll return to introduce Harold, and after his remarks, I'll come back and open the floor for questions. Michael Kazin is one of the nation's most respected historians of American politics and social movements and teaches history at Georgetown University. He has co-edited 3 books. He regularly contributes to newspapers such as the New York Times, periodicals and websites including the New Republic, where he has an online column. Michael is also the author of 5 books, including his most recent, American Dreamers, How the Left Changed the Nation. Also with distinguished political theorist Michael Walzer, he is co-editor of Dissent. Tonight, Michael will speak about the special section of the issue and how the authors paint a portrait of old and new face of labor and how this changing workforce is raising new questions about work is, how it shapes those who do it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Michael Kazin.
Thanks a lot, Kim, and thanks to everybody for coming. It's wonderful. I want to make sure everybody picks up a copy of the latest issue. If you're not a subscriber already, they're out there. And as Kim said, we want this to be a dialogue as much as possible. And stoked by the good food and drink out there. I hope you're all ready for that. So I'm going to just say a few things about what's in this issue and why I think it's important. First of all, I have my own thanks to deliver, of course. First to Joe, my colleague and good friend, for introducing the panel and talking about the magazine. And if you don't know about the Kamenowitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, how many people have never heard of it before they came here? Well, not that many. Well, you mostly know about it then, which is good. But, I think this is, one of the best institutions in America. I really do, because there's so few labor studies departments left in America today, and this is far more than a labor studies department. It's that too, but as Joe very modestly described it, it involves research, it involves activism, it brings together people from different walks of life to talk about the problems of labor and the working poor. This mild-mannered, quiet guy is really quite a steam engine. An internet of activity, and it's really an amazing institution. So also to Harold for agreeing to come and share his insights and knowledge. I look forward every week to opening the Washington Post because Harold is in there. And I'm a historian. I've read a lot of the Washington Post going back into the 1920s. There's never been a better columnist in the Washington Post.
Spoken like my mother.
E.J. Dion's pretty good too, but Harold's the best. Thanks very much to Kim for offering to moderate and talking about and these issues with us, to the AFL-CIO for letting us use old Sam Gomper's room. I'm not sure what Sam would think about what we have to say today, but perhaps we can talk about that. Thanks to Charlie Fanning for publicizing this event. Thanks to the Dissent staff, Maxine and Nick, and Sarah Leonard, Nick Serpi and Sarah Leonard for all they have done for today and every day. Thanks especially Jules Bernstein, who had this idea in the first place, as Kim said, and told everyone he knows it was taking place. And many of you, I think, are probably here because you got the email from Jules. I should also mention that Joe's book, wonderful book on the PATCO strike and the air traffic controllers is for sale over there on the table. So if you haven't read the wonderful book yet, please buy a copy. Well, I don't have to tell anyone in this crowd that organized labor is in trouble. The assault on public workers, the steady decline of membership in the private sector, the attacks on the National Labor Relations Board, the new attempt to pass a right-to-work law in Indiana, all demonstrate how much hard work needs to be done by those of us who believe in economic democracy in the workplace and, for that matter, everywhere in American society. But in order to understand what organized labor faces today, I think it's essential to understand what's going on in the lives of American workers themselves. Too much discussion of organized labor takes place in a sort of black box where people talk about what did labor do right, what it did wrong, and even among labor historians like Joe and myself, there's often not as much discussion about the context in which all this is taking place. So the immodest goal of the special section of this issue of Dissent is to try to understand not primarily what organized labor has done and not done, and is doing and is not doing, but to understand what American workers are thinking, what American workers are doing, their problems, and how a larger movement can be built to include more of them in improving their own lives. There's 6 pieces in this issue, and also a review in the back, so really 7 pieces. And of course, 7 articles can only offer glimpses of this complex, vital, and rapidly changing subject. But I think, again, immodestly, that each article provides valuable information and analysis about essential parts of the whole picture that in some ways we have metaphorically a glimpse of behind us today. So let me say a little bit about each of the main articles. The lead article is by a young graduate student named Max Fraser. Max spent last summer traveling through the midsection of America, stopping in Muncie, Indiana, and in Nashville, Tennessee, and some other places too. He interviewed a lot of people, a retired fireman who's become the mayor of Muncie, Indiana, that famous place that those of you who know your history and sociology know as Middletown, famous work by the Linds back in the 1920s. Max interviewed a housekeeper at a motel who used to work at a bar. He interviewed an auto worker who was going back and forth from working on the line to being unemployed, a cook, and many more. Some are native born, some are immigrants. He doesn't and really can't paint an optimistic picture about their lives. Let me just quote quickly a paragraph at the end of the piece, gives you a sense of the tone of it and the message as well. Max writes, "In place of the old stabilities of careers, of families, of communities, we have become a generation of the dislocated, a country of industrial gypsies and undocumented immigrants in constant search of the next job, of downwardly mobile public school teachers and auto worker permatemps, of impoverished servants to a post-industrial future, and 20-year-olds with no hope for one at all, citizens all of the new Middletowns." Obviously, these people are hurting, but they're not giving up. What they need, obviously, is allies. The next piece is by the distinguished labor historian and an old friend of mine, Dorothy Sue Cobble. And it's an angry piece. Anger is good when talking about a topic like this. Sue is the daughter and granddaughter of railroad workers from Georgia, and also labor activists. Her father was a head of the local of one of the railroad brotherhoods when she was growing up in Atlanta. And Sue was pissed off, not primarily at conservatives, which we get pissed off at all the time, but at commentators on the left, like Thomas Frank, for example, who she argues blame workers for the rise of conservatism. Sue points out that outside the South, white working class voters have sided with the Democratic Party as pretty much the same percentages as they did in the 1950s. So the idea that the white working class has moved wholeheartedly to the right, she argues is much mistaken. And she calls for scholars, for intellectuals, for journalists to think about what's happened to this country in much more creative and accurate terms than is often done. Next are 2 pieces of original reporting about 2 quite different but equally fast-growing groups of workers. First, professional freelancers, and second, home caregivers. First, Atossa Abrahamian profiles a group called the Freelancers Union, which I must admit, before Sarah Leonard, who's a friend and colleague of Atossa, told us about this article, I never heard of this organization, the Freelancers Union, so shows my ignorance. The Freelancers Union has over 200,000 members, mostly in New York City. It provides its members with low-cost health insurance, a lobbying arm at state legislatures, and plenty of networking events. Now, what it does not provide its members with, as Atossa makes clear, is collective bargaining. It's a 501c4. it's not eligible to hold elections under the National Labor Relations Act. In some ways, even though it's a very sort of new age labor organization, you might say, reading the article reminded me that in some ways it's a throwback to, for those of you who know your labor history, to the mechanics benefit societies that were popular in American cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore in the 1820s, even before there were trade unions. People used to figure out ways to help each other buy tools and get new tools when they broke and put money into a burial fund, this kind of thing. In some ways, the Freelancers Union is a 21st century equivalent of that. However, its members obviously are not carpenters and bricklayers and machinists. They are young, hip office workers, most in their 20s and 30s, a group which traditional unions have barely reached at all. So it's very clear from this article, which is really a wonderful piece of reportage, that we need to understand how people like this think, what they need, and how to help them get it. This is, in many ways, the cutting edge of a new labor force, and unless we understand how to reach them and how to organize them, we'll lose something very important in American life, and labor movement will be much the poorer for it. Next is a revealing article by historians Eileen Boris and Jennifer Klein on the women, most of whom are African Americans, who take care of disabled people and the elderly in their own homes in Chicago. These women are a vital section of the working poor, as we all know. Nationwide, home caregivers number close to 2 million people, almost all of them women, about evenly divided between African Americans and Latina immigrants, with a sprinkling of Asian American immigrants as well. Eileen and Jennifer detail their long and often successful struggle to gain a living wage and union recognition. And also, they talk about how recently they've had to stop the erosion of both kinds of victories. More recently, as they point out in Chicago, home care workers have been in the forefront of the fight against foreclosures and against cuts in heating assistance to the poor. So they paint what is a sobering, but also in some ways inspirational story. These people are fighting back in some ways, and that fight is one that very few people know about, unless you work directly with these folks. Finally, we have 2 review essays by 2 excellent scholars of labor, past and present. I must admit, we have a lot of labor historians in this issue, but I won't apologize for that. Each focuses on the travails of an important union, each with a distinct constituency. Nelson Lichtenstein writes a review essay about a new book by Frank Bardicke about the Farm Workers Union, and Jefferson Cowie writes a review of a book by someone, I forget his name, on the Air Traffic Controllers Union. I like a lot of Jeff's piece. There are a few things in there, criticisms I disagree with, but nevertheless, it's a smart piece in many ways. I won't take time summarizing their arguments, but each is, as every good historian has to be, and every good labor historian especially has to be, keenly aware of the context of the workplace in which both the United Farm Workers and PATCO emerged and then got into trouble. And by the way, I should say about Joe's book, another ad for Joe's book, it's much more than a labor history, though of course it's that too. It's really the best thing I've ever read about the airline industry itself, which is of course one of the major industries, not just in this country, but in the world. Both of these essays by Jeff Cowie on PATCO and by Nelson Lichtenstein on the UFW suggest, of course, how this history might have been and should have been different. There's also a very good review about a book about the precariat by John Schmidt. And in some ways, that makes me think of a common feature, which really unites all these pieces, despite the different workforces they talk about, despite the different subjects, different parts of the country they're writing about. That is precariousness. Precarious work, precarious unions, precarious lives, which adds up to, unfortunately, a precarious future in this country. Well, at Dissent, as well as here at the AFL-CIO, we are committed to turning that reality around, to helping bring security and democracy to American workers who are, after all, the indispensable majority of the American people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for summarizing the content of the issue. If you have not read it, I'm sure that you will want to pick up a copy before you leave this evening. I'd like to now introduce Harold Meyerson. Since August of 2002, Harold Meyerson has been editor-at-large of the American Prospect, the Washington-based liberal magazine founded by Robert Reich, Robert Kuttner, and Paul Starr in 1990. As such, he is one of the magazine's chief political writers and editors. In March of 2003, Meyerson became a regular Washington Post op-ed columnist, the best, as Michael mentioned. He is generally viewed as the most liberal voice on the Post op page, and his editorials have far reach, reprinted in numerous newspapers across the country and occasionally beyond. His articles on politics, labor, and the economy, foreign policy, and American culture have also appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Nation, The New Statesman, the op-ed and commentary and book review sections of the New York Times and the LA Times, and in numerous other publications. He is a member of the editorial board of Dissent, to which he frequently contributes political analysis. Tonight, Harold will talk about the political landscape on labor issues, the public discourse surrounding it, and the unique and important role that the intellectual magazine like Dissent plays in today's political climate. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Meyerson.
Thank you, Kim. You know, it's really no great achievement to be hailed as the leftmost columnist of the Washington Post.
George Will comes closer.
Yeah. So, but with that, I want to just echo what the previous speakers have said. It's a delight to be here. I'm really honored to be in the company of two such terrific historians whose books I have read, committed to memory. They're really important important works. While I'm at it, I also want to acknowledge the presence here of major representatives of our host, John Hyatt and Thea Lee, the Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff of the AFL-CIO. Thanks for the use of the hall. And one other Dissent editor who's here tonight, the longtime book review editor and my very good friend, Mark Levinson, whom many of you know through his trade union work. Those of you who understand the amoeba-like coming together and moving apart tendencies of American unions will understand what I say when I say that Mark has been, in order, the chief economist, I think, for the ILGWU, then Unite here, then Workers United, and then SEIU, without actually ever once changing his job. I could dwell on that, and that could be a valid topic of discussion, but I won't. Dissent set itself apart from the very start from the New York intellectual mold that it emerged from at that point, the partisan reviews and the commentaries and what have you, by not only the character of its articles, but its willingness to go out in the real America and report on it, which is sometimes not the way we think of Dissent. But this has been part of the magazine from the get-go, and in some ways that reflects the political heritage of its founders, of Irving Howe, of Stanley Plastrick, and others, who came out of a left-wing movement, some of whose members, as was the custom in those days, had gone into the plants, as they said, and were organic intellectuals or not so organic intellectuals, working in factories and trying to impact what it was that such crucial organizations as the UAW actually was doing. We've heard an allusion already to Irving's book with Jack Whittick on the UAW, more or less, I'd say, giving it critical support from the left. And this is a tradition to which Dissent has periodically returned, and very significantly and very importantly at a time when American workers are going through a number of changes, almost all of them bad, that it's returned to in its really stellar new issue, and I very much recommend that you check it out. Going into the plants sounds utterly archaic, and yet I think when we look at the speech that President Obama delivered just last night, we've suddenly heard more about manufacturing from the highest levels of the American government than we have in a very, very, very long time. What I look at when I put that speech together, even with some things that Obama's potential rivals, some Republican presidential candidates, are saying, is that at least a very central idea that American elites have tried to impress on the rest of us has fallen into such disfavor, it probably is may for a while be on the way out. And that idea is that, well, America transformed itself from an agrarian to an industrial society, and that was okay. And now we're going to transform ourselves from an industrial to a post-industrial society, and that'll be okay too. I think we're at a moment where a tipping point has been reached on that last assertion, whether moving to a post-industrial society actually has been good for the American nation as a whole and the American people as individuals. This is not only, I think, reflected in the emergence more fully of Barack Obama's inner economic nationalist, which we saw last evening, but also in some of the things said by candidates like Rick Santorum, who beat Obama to the punch on wanting to cut taxes for domestic manufacturing. And even, although I don't believe he would do it, even Mitt Romney, who has said the day he'll take office, he'll impose tariffs on Chinese imports so long as they continue the lowballing of their currency. But all of these policies, and I don't mean to equate Obama's, which are considerably more equitable and far-reaching, with those of the Republican candidates, and some other Republican candidates, too, who are no longer in the field, like John Huntsman, who used to speak a great deal about manufacturing in his stump speech. All of these reflect a depressing awareness not only on the level of American macroeconomics, that we have a trade deficit that's unsustainable, that the reason we're in hock to China is because manufacturing went over there, usually at the direction of American multinational corporations, and so on, that this is not only not sustainable on the national level, but that it's been accompanied by, and is one source, only one, but one major source of the general wage stagnation or downward mobility or casualization of work that has affected American workers over the past 30 years, and that Max Fraser and others write so well about in this issue. But I want to make the point that even if, as those of you who read me know, I bang the drum for manufacturing repeatedly, that even a renaissance of American manufacturing, while a necessary condition for helping restart the American middle class, is by no means a sufficient condition for a couple of reasons. First of all, if I spent some time in factories myself in the Midwest this past September, the number of workers required to do the work that was done 15, 20 years ago by a lot more workers has obviously shrunk. These factories are more automated. They use robotics. So even the expansion of manufacturing by opening more factories or reopening more factories will not bring back an industrial workforce of the size that this country had 10, 20, 30 years ago. Secondly, and again, this is something that Max Fraser found and that I found, manufacturing work not only ain't what it used to be in terms of its relative capital intensiveness, but it doesn't pay as well. The new wage in manufacturing is usually somewhere between $14 an hour and $19 an hour. Do the math. That's $28,000 to $38,000 a year. That is not comparable to what unionized production workers were making in the much of the second half of the 20th century. It's not the kind of income that facilitates home buying, new car purchases, much less paying college tuitions. There was one factory I went to in North Canton, Ohio. This was one of these inshoring companies that we heard so much about last night, making Eden Pure space heaters. And the amazing thing about this company was that it was paying in a durable goods factory in Ohio in 2011 minimum wage. You could make more working at Walmart, maybe. And the economy was sufficiently depressed that they had no trouble staffing up. Unlike some of the inshoring companies, they weren't all that capital intensive either. Indeed, in some ways, I didn't even think of it, some of these companies say we've gone beyond 20th century manufacturing. Well, the way in which this company had gone beyond 20th century manufacturing was instead of an automated assembly line, they had tables like this, and once the workers finished turning their screws, they picked it up and handed it to the next person down the table. So that's 19th century manufacturing. It sort of harks back to pre-Henry Ford assembling. But what's more depressing is I went to one of these state-of-the-art, incredibly futuristic factories making lithium-ion batteries for electric cars. It's received considerable funding both from the state of Michigan and from the Obama administration. The A123 battery factory in Livonia, Michigan, a little bit outside Detroit. You feel like you're almost watching a motion picture of the future of work when you look in some of these sealed rooms and workers going around in something almost like surgical garb, making sure that all these machines are doing what they should do. But they were making $14 an hour too. It's probably a growing company. There are promotions. There are all kinds of things associated with a startup that is probably going fairly well given the vagaries of the market. But this is the wage. This is the wage. And what this leads to, and what this has cumulatively led to as middle-income jobs with middle-income wages have increasingly vanished from the United States, is something that the right is now picking up on. Rich Lowry has written about this, Michael Gerson, Ross Duthout, and now in a new book, alas for us all, Charles Murray, author of The Bell Curve, has produced a study of whites in America in which he it's about this huge gap between the levels of family stability and marriage and non-divorce or divorce, this huge gap that's emerged between white upper-middle-class professionals and the white working class. And this is going to be, I think, a real interesting topic for magazines like Dissent or the place where I work, the American Prospect, to deal with in coming months, because all of these folks see this as mainly a problem rooted in culture. And Murray's solution, and we have to put the word solution in quotes, is that white upper-middle-class professionals need to spend more time with people in the working class and thereby somehow magically impart their more old style, as it were, cultural values to that class. I think what we're seeing here is best described by the great sociologist William Julius Wilson's work on what happened to the black family as work disappeared. And for him, the key factor was the decline in the number of marriageable males. I want to suggest to you that the white working class has seen a considerable decline in the number of marriageable males, and that the spike, which is huge, in childbirth out of wedlock, of divorces, and of family dissolution, and even church attendance in the white working class, is one manifestation of the kind of thing we're talking about here tonight, workers in an age of austerity. But if manufacturing won't bring the buffalo back, won't in and of itself reinvent the American middle class, I mean, it has to be accompanied by some other things. Certainly, a far better system of vocational education. The Germans seem to know how to do this very well. And certainly by unionization. I mean, everybody here knows that the decline of the middle class and the decline of American unions have a basic relationship. It's called causal. And there is no way you can get the middle class back. There's no historic precedent for it, absent the very thing that so many people in this room spend their time and energy, so many friends of mine here, working long hours and racking their brains, which is how to rebuild the American labor movement in a time when the legal impediments to such and the economic impediments to such are very daunting. And at times when our trade policies, even with the modifications that the President suggested last night, continue to put downward pressure on the wages and incomes of American workers. In fact, just to make the challenge a little starker for us all, given the share of workers who will be in the manufacturing economy, even if it increases, as it is to a certain degree going up now, at least in raw numbers, if not in share, the task before labor still remains unionization, not simply of manufacturing, but of retail and of service sector work. Just as organizing General Motors was the key to the expansion of industrial unionism in the 1930s, not to depress the hell out of everyone, but I still think organizing Walmart would be the key to the kind of rebirth of American unions and therefore the middle class that we clearly so desperately need and that Dissent reports on and advocates with power, elegance, and brilliance. Thank you.